Folks, we are about to begin. Can you please take your seats?
Good to see you. Doing well.
Either way, I'm going to go from the podium.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you.
Either way.
Thank you. Wow, that worked well. And I want to welcome everybody to Congregation B'nai Shalom. My name is Jeff Govendo, and I am a member of Congregation B'nai Shalom's Social Action Committee, which is responsible for bringing this program to you this evening. Tonight, we have three distinguished panelists, each an expert on the very sobering but important topic of the evening, who will each present for about 15 minutes or so. I'll be introducing each of them more fully before they go on. We also have Congressman Jim McGovern here to address the audience, and I'll be introducing him a little more fully in just a moment also. And just before we leave, our own Rabbi Gurevitz would like to offer a few thoughts about hope for the future. There will be time after all of the panelists have presented for your questions and comments. So please hold them until then. You'll notice on the programs that you picked up, hopefully everybody picked up a program, that there is space for you to jot down some notes, questions, thoughts that you have. So please use those. And after all of the panelists have presented, we'll open it up to the audience. And we hope on your way in that you picked up the list of action items. What can you do to respond to hate-related incidents? If you didn't pick it up on the way in, there's a pile of them right on the table as you're leaving. That's a very important component of tonight's program. There's also a program from a recent Anti-Defamation League program that was held in Newton a couple of weeks ago. It is their toolkit on dealing with hate-related matters also. Very valuable too. Lastly, I would like to recognize and thank the many people who've worked to put this program together, including our own planning committee, Amy Rosenberg, Mason Haber, Ted Shoemaker, Richard Halpern, also Rabbi Gurevitz for her support and inspiration, Steve Weiner, our Temple's executive director for just about everything, Jane Gordon for helping with our publicity, Stephen Goldstein, who's actually not here tonight, has worked behind the scene on the technology for this event. And to let you know, this evening's proceedings are being live streamed to possibly a larger audience than what we have here. And I'd also like to thank the many volunteers here this evening who are helping out with tonight's proceedings, and to the Jewish Federation of Central Massachusetts for their general sponsorship of this program. And in that vein, I would like to quickly introduce the Executive Director of the Federation, Steve Schimmel.
Thank you very much. It's our honor to be a co-sponsor of tonight's event. Jewish Federation, for those of you who don't know, is the infrastructure of the Jewish community, and one of our contemporary roles is working to combat hate, and in particular anti-Semitism. Difficult task, and I hope one that you'll help us to combat. This is the 81st anniversary of Kristallnacht this weekend, a night when Jewish homes and synagogues were destroyed across Germany. It was the manifestation of the Nazi hatred really in physical form. But it's important to note that two events preceded that. The first was that summer when the countries of the world gathered together and looked around and thought to themselves, what can we do about the Jewish refugees? Well, the world was divided into two places at that point. Places where Jews could not go and places where Jews could not live. And 2 months prior to Kristallnacht was the Sudeten crisis, a moment when the world came together once again for another conference with terrible results and appeased Hitler's desire to annex part of Czechoslovakia. You'll remember Neville Chamberlain leaving the plane saying, "We've secured peace in our time." I bring that moment in history, that very dark moment in history, to the podium tonight for two reasons. There are very important lessons to be learned there. The first is that as Jews, we had no refuge in those times. Today we do. take the lessons that you might want to learn from that into your own heart. And the second is that we must take seriously those who seek our destruction. The writing was on the wall, the blueprint was there, and we weren't able to do anything about it. And today we can. Zev Jabotinsky, one of the early Zionist leaders, traveled Europe in the 1930s, and he told the communities there, "You are sitting on a volcano." And they were. And they sat, and 6 million lives were taken because of it. We cannot allow that to happen today. We must be united, we must stand strong, and we must call out anti-Semitism wherever it is and whenever it happens, whether it's in our own party or in the opposite political party. We should not stand for it. We must not stand for it. And I hope that all of you tonight will join our efforts to make sure that when we say never again, we are serious about it. That is what Jewish Federation stands for. That's what the congregation stands for. And I know that that's what all of you stand for. Thank you very much.
Folks, I want to introduce Congressman McGovern. Jim McGovern has represented the Greater Worcester area in the House of Representatives since 1996. He has been an outspoken advocate and legislator on issues such as genocide prevention, sensible gun laws, the climate crisis, and domestic terrorism. In 2018, with the new Democratic majority in the House, he became chair of the House Rules Committee. I suspect things are fairly busy for him in DC right now. So we're more than delighted that he could find the time to be with us this evening. So Congressman Jim McGovern.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Well, let me say that I'm grateful to be here tonight, and I want to start by thanking Jeff Govendo for his work to put this important conversation together. You're going to hear from our three distinguished panelists who will lead us in discussion, and I'm looking forward to that. I also want to thank the Congregation B'nai Shalom for hosting this important discussion, specifically Rabbi Rachel Gurovitz, who I hold in high esteem, who I think is a voice of reason and conscience in our community, and she's been an incredible leader and has done so much over these past few years to push back against hate and to build understanding in our community. And Steve Schimmel, thank you, and the Jewish Federation for your leadership and for your important voice here. You know, I used to think the older I got, the more things would be clear. I would understand things better. And it seems the older I'm getting, the more confused I'm getting, and the more I can't explain things. You know, I co-chair in the House of Representatives the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Tom Lantos is the only Holocaust survivor to ever serve in the United States Congress. And so every week we are holding hearings on another human rights atrocity somewhere in the world. And, you know, I can't quite understand why there are people who decide that they want their very existence to be about highlighting their differences and putting other people down. It seems to me to be such a terrible waste of time and effort. It accomplishes nothing. But yet there are many, not only around the world, but here in our own country, who choose to do that. A week and a half ago was a hectic week in Congress with impeachment inquiry resolutions. But we also did something else that week. We actually voted overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives to officially acknowledge the Armenian genocide. And I talked about that when I first got elected to Congress, going to these commemorations and at the Armenian church in Worcester, and the first few rows would be filled with survivors. I mean, when I first got elected, there were 60 survivors in the Greater Worcester area. The last survivor, Rose, died in 2015, so now there are no survivors. And I was thinking as we were debating this resolution that people were very much, you know, that some people were pushing very hard for us not to consider, but I was thinking about the fact that, we should have done this a long time ago. And the fact that we have not acknowledged history, that we have not acknowledged the truth, really has implications. It paves the way for other hateful people to do terrible things. When Hitler went into Poland in 1939, he referenced what happened to the Armenians and said nobody remembers, nobody has acknowledged it. So it is important that we understand our history and world history as we move forward. Now look, I'm not here to sugarcoat things. In my opinion, our country is heading in the wrong direction on so many issues right now. Whether it comes to our tax policy, which seems to favor the wealthy over the middle class, or whether it's pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement when we obviously have a climate crisis on this planet, or whether it is a proliferation of gun violence in this country, we have a lot of work to do to try to get back on the right course. But what I'm most alarmed about, to be honest with you, is the political space which has opened up in this country in which hate has been allowed to proliferate. There's plenty of blame to go around on this issue. I mean, there are hateful people on the right and there are hateful people on the left. We all know that. And it's tempting for us to point fingers and blame the president and his rhetoric. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I find his words and his actions on many occasions to be, quite frankly, disgusting. But what bothers me about him is that he has empowered the worst elements in our society, and he has emboldened hate in a way that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. But to be honest with you, I mean, it's not just about the president, it's about the forces that that swept him into office to begin with. I mean, it's about those who have refused to accept responsibility for some of the things that he tweets out or that he says. It's about the proliferation of hate online that emboldens white supremacists and anti-Semites and Islamophobia by connecting these hateful people with others who share their hateful views. And it's about our politics becoming nastier and more vindictive, embracing a culture that tears people down and pits groups against one another instead of lifting people up and embracing our differences as a source of strength. And what scares me the most, it is much harder to put hate back into the box once it has been let out than it is to change policy or to fix a law. Now, don't get me wrong, and hate has been a factor in world history, and we know that. It's been around here in the United States as well. It isn't a new phenomenon. It isn't something that should surprise any of us that it exists. But I truly believe that our country, for a long time, was moving in a direction where I thought that we were moving away from that, where it was politically unacceptable for people to, at least publicly, get out there and espouse some of these hateful views. And that seems to have changed. In some quarters, it's fashionable to embrace hatred. Hatred against people who have different religions, hatred against immigrants, hatred against, people who live their life differently than we do. And we only need to look at the news to see the tragic toll that hate is taking in our society. I mean, the Pulse nightclub, the Mother Emanuel Church, the Tree of Life Synagogue, deadly clashes in Charlottesville. And no, there's no moral equivalency between the peaceful protesters and the white supremacists that were shouting anti-Semitic rhetoric and who were, saying things that, quite frankly, any of us would view as racist and totally unacceptable. And we see it in the attacks on the immigrant community, which, is particularly frightening because it is reminiscent of a history, not only here but in other countries, that has been used to justify some pretty horrible things. Now, if the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging that you have one, I think we need to say this loud and clear. We got a problem. This year, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number of hate groups in America rose to an all-time high. FBI statistics show that hate crimes increased by 30% in the 3-year period ending in 2017. The increase followed a 3-year period in which hate crime incidents fell by 12%. And so this isn't just a problem in rural America, by the way. A new report from the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, headquartered at California State University in San Bernardino, has found that hate crimes rose 9% in 30 major American cities in 2018. And those are just the ones that we know about. We also know that we have a very big problem with many hate crimes in this country going unreported. While the FBI lists a few thousand of hate crimes per year, a survey by the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that the number is much, much larger than that, probably over 200,000 per year. So where do we go from here? Now, some of it we can do legislatively, and we need to pursue laws that combat this. Earlier this year, the House of Representatives passed the LGBTQ Equality Act to ensure that LGBTQ Americans have the same rights as everyone else. And it'd be nice if the Senate would take it up so we can make it very clear that our government is on the side of equal rights for every single person in this country. As I mentioned earlier, a complete understanding of the national problem posed by hate crimes is hindered by incomplete data from federal, state, and local jurisdictions. We have a bill that Congressman Beutel of Virginia has introduced called the No Hate Act, and the bill would provide incentives for hate crime reporting, provide grants for state-run hate crime hotlines, and establish additional penalties for individuals convicted under existing hate crimes legislation. We ought to move forward on that. Now, these laws won't fix things overnight, and sometimes it takes a while for our policies to reflect shifts in American culture. But here's what we do know. Laws can work, and they are very, very powerful. Look to the past, and we see how the Voting Rights Act made a big difference in this country. The Civil Rights Act, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and others have led to shifts in our society. And while I don't have a whole lot of hope that this administration can change, I do know that there are many career civil servants throughout the federal government who know this is a problem and are focused in on fighting it. Just recently, for example, the Department of Homeland Security added white supremacist violence to its list of priority threats to their new national counterterrorism strategy. And this is encouraging news, and I hope a signal that there are some people working to take the threat of hate and hate-fueled violence seriously in this country. I mentioned earlier immigration, and you know, we are in Massachusetts, and we consider ourselves to be a progressive-minded state. We have progressive Democrats and progressive Republicans, and we like to think that you know, we have moved beyond certain things. But I do a lot of town hall meetings, and I do a lot of meetings in coffee shops with people. And you know, the issue of immigration gets brought up quite a bit. And it's one thing to say we need to fix our immigration laws. It's one thing to say we ought to make it easier for people to come here legally. It's one thing to say that, you know, there are things that we need to debate. But what bothered me about the meetings, many of the meetings that I've been at, is the language that people use. We're being invaded. There's an infestation. You know, almost trying to make it seem that the people who are trying to immigrate here are somehow not human. And I find that very, very disturbing. I've been to the border several times. I've spent a lot of time in Central America. Many of the people coming here are fleeing some of the worst violence imaginable. Their mothers and their kids, their fathers, you know, who are fleeing for their lives. They're human beings. And yet we are talking about them in a way that we demean their very existence. And I think when we do that, it makes it easier for some to justify policies that, quite frankly, are inhumane. You know, we have a law in this country, and it's international law too, that if somebody is fleeing violence, if they have a well-founded fear of persecution, they have a right to come here and to ask for asylum. I mean, and we're denying them that. I've met with fathers and mothers whose kids have been taken from them. I met with a father in Honduras whose son had been taken, 6-year-old son had been taken from him 3 months earlier. He had been deported back to Honduras. The son was sent to New York. I mean, and when you talk about some of the cruelty of the policies that are going forward, again, it's easier for some to justify if we don't remind us, if we don't think of them as us. Because other than, the fate of geography as to where we were born, I mean, we could have been born in El Salvador or in Honduras right now. So people, people come away all the time and ask, how can I help fight back? And I think the answer is simple. I mean, we cannot give up, and we cannot give in. Just being here today, I think, is a powerful message. I was saying to the rabbi, I mean, this is a Sunday night, tomorrow's a holiday, and, this place is filled. So people obviously care, and I think that in and of itself is an important statement. Showing up is an important statement. But we need to continue to have these conversations once we leave here today. Because sometimes the conversations we need to have are with our family members. Sometimes they're with people we work with, and sometimes they're people we meet in a coffee shop. I go to Dunkin' Donuts every morning to get my coffee. I'm used to people saying a few things when I walk in. Now I stop and I engage, especially when I know people are saying things that I know are wrong. My wife has said I need to learn to use the drive-through, but the bottom line is, the challenge is not just the president and Congress and state legislators and elected officials. The challenge is all of us have a role to play. Right? We all have power. We all have influence, and we need to use it, and we need to speak out, especially during these times. We need our faith-based leaders to do more. I mean, I admire the rabbi here, who I think is a leader, but faith-based leaders of all faiths, all across the country, need to be speaking out more. We're supposed to love our neighbor. I think we need to be reminded of that more often. And we have to be reminded about what our moral responsibility is to those who are fleeing violence. And our politics have to change. And this is really hard to do, especially in this era of social media and online attacks and anonymous whatever. It's really, really hard to do. But it is something that we must do. Mario Cuomo had a great line. He says, we should believe in a government strong enough to use words like love and compassion, and smart enough to convert our noblest aspirations into political realities. We need to elect people at every level, at our boards of selectmen, at our mayoral levels, at our gubernatorial levels, at a national level, who are going to tell us not how low we can sink, so they can divide the electorate and win victories, but how high we can rise. We need to be inspired. We need to be reminded about, what we're all about. And so I'll just close with this. I used to have a history teacher who used to end every class by saying the same thing over and over. He used to say, remember, the world will not get better on its own. And to be honest with you, when I took his class, I didn't quite know what the hell he was talking about. I was like, why is he saying that? I do now. I do now. I mean, nothing changes. Nothing changes unless like-minded people come together and demand the change. And you look through our history, you look through world history, I mean, things have changed. We have been through bad times before, and we have emerged from them. We have only emerged because people have come together and demanded that we change. I mean, I have 2 kids who I love more than anything else in the world. I want them to have a better world than we have right now. I mean, I got to be honest with you, as a parent, I worry when my kids say they're going to a concert. I worry when they go to a movie theater now. I mean, I have to now worry when they go to worship at a church or a synagogue or a mosque. I mean, because those places aren't immune from violence. This can't be who we are. I mean, this can't be. And I really believe in the goodness of people. I really do. And I think that that goodness needs to shine. So I just will say I thank you for doing this. This is an incredibly important conversation. I don't think we're all going to get all the answers here tonight, but I think the first step is that we all need to be committed to creating that better world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman. Wonderful. Great way to start us off. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Alejandro Beutel is an independent research scholar who has published extensively on topics related to American Muslims, interfaith engagement, Islamism, the U.S. far right, and combating non-state ideologically motivated violence. From 2017 to 2019, Alejandro was a senior research analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he focused on the U.S. anti-Muslim and anti-government movements. He is also a research affiliate at the University of Maryland's START Center, which means Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, and a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in New York. Tonight, Alejandro will provide a brief overview of the U.S. far-right milieu and several of its most common beliefs, concepts, and tropes. Alejandro Beutel.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, one more time, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, excellent. I'm half Latino and half deaf, but sometimes just need a little bit of extra. Appreciate that. Let's see if we can get the PowerPoint going here. In the meantime, as we're getting the PowerPoint set up, again, I just wanted to thank you all for coming here. Representative McGovern, thank you very much. I'll just say really quickly that, coming to this topic itself, I try to be as dispassionate and objective as possible because I've come at this as an academic, tried to study it as a research scholar for a number of years, and yet hearing Representative McGovern's remarks, being in a house of worship today, I'm always reminded as well that no matter what, even to the best of my abilities, that I can never fully distance myself from it emotionally, right? So you have a guy up here who's standing before you in a Jewish house of worship with the name Alejandro Beutel, and wearing this sort of a piece of cloth on his head and wondering, my God, that must be an awfully large kippah. It's actually a kufi, so I am Latino, as the name would suggest. I'm also half Italian. I'm half Salvadoran, from Central America. My father's Jewish, my mother's Catholic, and then there's me. America, right? So, it's one of those things where, and I'm also a father. I have a beautiful, beautiful boy who just turned 1 year, just a week ago, actually. And like the representative, I worry like crazy for him. I look into his eyes and I think, what a wonderful future I can potentially give him. But then I also have to remember that there are some serious challenges ahead. And one of them is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so off the top of my memory here, what I'm going to do is, while we're still working on that, is to just sort of, to use a football analogy, I'm calling an audible on this one. And we're just going to roll with it. So basically what I want to be able to do is talk about, I think, essentially an overview of the far right, some of the common beliefs, tropes, narratives that you see across there, Before running out of time, because again, like a relapsed academic, I could drone on and on and on, but one of the things that I just want to do really quickly, I think, is to connect some of the consistent themes that one may see when engaging then with some of the specific components of what we often label as the far right. And so, first and foremost, I think that many of us are going to be intimately familiar with is going to be racism and bigotry. It may come in very sort of overt forms, like a swastika on or racial epithets. Sometimes it may come in more, shall we say, coded in dog whistle terms. So, for instance, the notion of talking about welfare queens, or as of late, since there's been concerns about anti-Semitism, a lot of the attacks against someone like George Soros, or whenever people talk about the Federal Reserve and then mention, like Janet Yellen, or a few other people like Alan Greenspan, who happen to be Jewish. These sorts of attacks that are there, they are in many ways sort of various forms of coded bigotry that's there. Another feature that you will also find in many of these beliefs is also going to be conspiracism. So a lot of people are not going to be trusting in mainstream news sources and beliefs. So there's going to be a lot of conspiracies that are going to be taking place. A lot of xenophobia, a lot of nativism. So and then finally underlying all of this as well is a lot of toxic masculinity, a lot of constructions of manhood being, and the notion that men oftentimes need to be fairly violent. So when I'm talking about then the far right, here are the 5 sort of different sections that I'm looking at. I'm not going to repeat verbatim from the slide, but that's essentially what we're looking at. Dr. Perliger as well is going to go into a little bit more from a data-driven perspective, but for now this is essentially a sort of a short overview of that. And again, these are the general themes and patterns that you will often see. One thing that I do want to just point out in closing on this, though, is the notion of producerism. And you're going to find this manifesting itself in different ways in different parts of the far right. But the general sense of what a producerist narrative is if anyone's worked in a tool shop, for instance, and know what a vise is, right? You can imagine a vise squeezing things together. And so the idea of a producerist narrative then is that you essentially have the elite parasites and then you have subversive parasites. So the elite parasites up at the top, subversive parasites from the bottom, coming in together, and if not working in a conspiratorial fashion to squeeze the middle, then it just so happens then that this is sort of the net effect that a lot of people think is happening. And so this is what is essentially what's known as a producerist narrative, where you have essentially lazy, sinful people at the top and the bottom who are trying to squeeze out the people who are real Americans or real authentic individuals, whether they're white people, whether they're going to be, people with citizenship, people who are non-Muslim, whatever, what have you. They're the ones that are getting squeezed by this conspiracy then from top to bottom, and there's this notion then of producerisms, the haves and the have-nots, or rather the people who are doing the real work to hold up society versus the ones who are leeching off of it. And this is a consistent theme that's going to run and manifest itself in different ways throughout different sections of the far right. Now, of course, everybody, when they think of the far right, the most immediate thing that they're going to automatically think of is off the top of their head is going to be white nationalism and white supremacy. Some people may try to make a distinction. I think for tonight's audience here, I want to be very clear that in the real world, it's a distinction without a difference. Let me just say that up front. And so at the end of the day, one of the common narratives that has been that many of you may have heard of and has probably been reported upon in the media, especially in light of things like the terrorist attacks in El Paso, Christchurch, Poway, California, and even more recently in Germany as well, is the notion of white genocide. That the idea that there is this conspiracy taking place where white people, however they're defined, as a race is slowly dying off or being killed off due to a conspiracy of trying to create intermarriage, race mixing, and open immigration policies that will essentially create demographic shifts taking place in what are traditionally thought to be white countries. And so this has been a narrative that has motivated, or at least been used as a justification for a lot of the attacks that have been taking place. Given that we're short on time, I'm just going to go through some of the other ones very quickly. One thing I do want to briefly mention here is that even something like this, there's been a lot of advertisement out there for white genocide narratives, so it's not something that has been limited to the fringe, but unfortunately has been increasingly mainstreamed over the years. If you'll just notice really quickly at the very bottom, the Overton window, that's something that I want to get into a little bit more perhaps during the question and answer, but it's basically the idea, though, that one of the strategies of white supremacists is to try and mainstream their rhetoric as much as possible. They're not satisfied just with violence. What they're looking to do is to bring about a cultural and political shift that will also then lead to different changes in public policy as well, and that's where the shifting of the Overton window takes place. Male supremacy, many of you may have heard of something called the incels, or involuntary celibates. This is just simply the idea, for instance, that you have men who are focused on men being on top. It's often based on an assumption that men are oppressed and women are actually considered to be the privileged group that's there. And so there's a lot of different terminology that takes place. Like white supremacists, particularly the alt-right online, you'll also have the notion of pilling. Red pill being like, this is my political enlightenment. Black pilling being like, the system can't change. It's completely nihilist. And unfortunately, in one case, you'll even have some people espousing the notion of rape pilling, which is that the only way to have any sort of intercourse with women is, well, you guessed it. So this is a part of the male supremacy. Unfortunately, there's a significant amount of overlap that takes place between white supremacists and the male supremacists. The ADL actually has a wonderful report that was done on the overlap between the two contexts and milieus. This is just sort of one of the internet memes that you'll often find depicting sort of like the idea of what is a strong ideal male versus what is considered to be sort of like a beta male versus an alpha male. The alpha male being the Chad, this very strong masculine individual, the virgin being the one who would be picked on and bullied at school, so to speak. The anti-government patriot movement. Now, a lot of people often think of, when they think of the patriot movement, they'll often think of someone like Timothy McVeigh, but they'll also often perhaps think of them as synonymous with white supremacists. Anti-government folks are typically more concerned with the federal government. That said, hate is never far behind. A lot of their hate and bigotry is implicit. The one key exception to that, as of late, has actually been explicit anti-Muslim hatred and bigotry that's there. A good example is in 2015, there were 3 militiamen that were arrested for attempting to carry out a terrorist attack against a Somali community in the middle of Kansas. They're animated by a number of different conspiracy theories that are there. Again, I can talk about that more during the question and answer, but one of the things that I just want to point out here is that these different conspiracy theories themselves often, again, they may not engage in explicit racism, but the dog whistle and the hate is never very far behind. And so often the language will be about globalism. They'll talk about the New World Order. They'll talk about fears of the UN taking over the United States. But in other cases, as I mentioned before, George Soros being someone who's a person that's typically attacked by individuals on the far right. This is a screenshot actually of a patriot anti-government extremist who lives here in Massachusetts, not very far from here actually. And if you have a moment to read it, basically what she's doing is she's on the anniversary of on the anniversary of Holocaust Memorial Day, she's commemorating it by villainizing and demonizing George Soros. So in some ways, this is some of the perniciousness of how these things work is that In this particular case, they use philo-Semitism as a way then to insert coded dog whistle anti-Semitism into the discourse. Really quickly, the anti-immigrant hate movement, the one thing that I just want to point out here, I think that's going to be particularly important, is the notion again of invasion. Thank you very much, Representative McGovern, for mentioning, I think, the discourse that's there. White supremacists have picked this up as of late, and in many ways, you know, in the most violent way possible, that they have made this, they've brought this term much more out into the open. But the group that initially pioneered and tried to push this for many years was actually the anti-immigrant hate movement itself. This is actually the cover from one of the magazine's prominent pieces of literature that's there on there, obviously describing migrants and immigrants as an invasion force. This magazine, unfortunately, as I found out through my online investigations, is also in the offices, unfortunately, of several elected officials in Washington, D.C. So there are people that are unfortunately reading this, and this kind of rhetoric is mainstreamed in more than one way. Finally, of course, is the anti-Muslim hate movement. Generally speaking, this runs on a number of premises and tropes, the number one being that Islam itself is not a religion, but instead is a hateful ideology. What people will find is that students, people who study, white supremacy will often find that there are very striking parallels then to the narratives in white supremacy in the anti-Muslim hate movement, the most prominent of which I think we saw on display very violently and very tragically was in Christchurch, New Zealand, which was the Great Replacement. That is basically just a Muslim-centric variant of the white genocide narrative itself. But there are other ones that are out there. But essentially, this is the idea, though, that Muslims themselves are this malignant force that are not to be trusted. They're a fifth column that are there. And so oftentimes, whenever Muslims come into a new community, with them, then they try to take over that community. That's the idea of creeping Sharia or stealth jihad. So even an anti-Muslim activist who's seeing me come up here and speak to you today would argue that what I'm doing here is essentially creeping Sharia. So with that said, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Sobering. Our next speaker is Dr. Arie Perliger. He is a professor and the director of the graduate program in security studies at the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. Before his arrival to UMass Lowell, Dr. Perliger was the director of terrorism studies and the associate professor at the Combating Terrorism Center and Department of Social Sciences, U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Over the past 18 years, Dr. Perliger has been engaged in an extensive study of issues related to terrorism and political violence and the politics of extremism of the far right in Israel, Europe, and the United States. He has provided professional briefings to high-rank officials from the government and military, such as the Secretary of the Army and the Army Chief of Staff. He's the editor-in-chief of the journal Democracy and Security. Dr. Perliger will discuss the contemporary landscape of the violent American far right, highlighting some of the unique ideological and operational characteristics of the different groups. Additionally, he will address some relevant counter-policies and what specifically communities can do in order to develop better resilience to threats from white supremacy and related groups. Dr. Perliger.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, so I would like to thank you for the invitation. I'm actually a bit more optimistic, I think, than the congressman. I think there's some positive changes. At least today, we actually acknowledge that there's a threat, that there's actually a policy problem that we need to face and that we need to solve. I can tell you that when I published my first research on the far right, That was around 2012. And several things happened when my study was published. First of all, West Point's superintendent, which is the equivalent to a university president, got hundreds of letters calling to sack me immediately. He didn't fire me. Nonetheless, there was significant pressure on him to do something about this professor that suddenly decided to study domestic violence rather than to produce another study about jihadi groups. Also, many alumni actually pulled back some donations and money. We lost several $1 million of alumni who decided that they don't want to give us money anymore. Not to West Point, not to the center that I was part of, just because they didn't think that this is something that's actually, it's worthwhile to study. And finally, I got, as usual, a lot of threats to the point in which I actually had to be escorted by 2 FBI agents that basically had to take care or to check out that indeed none of these threats are actually will actually materialize. So at least today, when I'm talking about the far right, when I'm publishing about the far right, I think most people actually acknowledge and understand that this is a substantial policy issue that we need to deal with, and that it's becoming a significant threat to our society and to our nation. So at least we can be a bit more optimistic about that we actually now, at least we recognize the threat. So I'll start by giving you a very, very quick brief about the major groups or the major streams that comprise the contemporary American far right. So as you can see at the top, we have what we call the racist bloc, and Alejandro mentioned some of these groups. We're talking about basically different groups that want to restore what they see as the natural racial hierarchy. Basically, they want to restore the superior status of what they perceive as the white race or the Aryan race. And by the way, they actually distinguish between different types of white people. So for example, for them, the Aryan, the top race is actually just white people who are descendants of the nation of Northern Europe. So if you are an Italian or Spanish or Greek, you actually do not belong in their eyes to the Aryan race. My apologies, Alejandro. Neo-Nazis and skinheads are basically two movements that actually emerged in Europe, as some of you probably know, and at some point basically immigrated to the United States. They both promote and justify white supremacist ideas and related policies, but they come out from different, basically, ideological origins. The skinheads emerged originally from dynamics of class warfare in the UK in the 70s. If you remember, when Margaret Thatcher basically crashed the workers' unions and the middle class, one of the backlash was the emergence of the skinheads movement, and eventually parts of it also adopted racist militant views. The anti-federalist bloc, that's basically the militia or the patriot movement. These are different groups that basically see the federal government as an entity that threaten their constitutional rights. They believe that the federal government is an intrusive entity that is interested in enhancing its powers, and eventually they also believe that there's a need to engage in activities that will counter the tendency of the federal government to expand its powers. And finally, the Christian fundamentalist bloc. Here we're talking about various far-right groups that justify racist, xenophobic views by providing their own unique interpretations of religious texts. So if you go to some of their websites and some of their publications, for example, they will provide you a lot of literature that explains how according to their own interpretations, the Bible actually justify white supremacy, justify anti-homosexuality, and so on and so forth. But let's talk a little bit more about what's actually going on right now in our country. And what you can see here on the slide, this is basically a graph that represents the number of attacks by far-right groups or by individuals who want to promote far-right values or ideology, basically since the 1990s. and 2017. And there's two very clear trends that we can see here. First of all, there's a rise in the level of violence. Yes, there's some ups and downs, but overall, when you compare it to the 90s, for example, it's very clear that today we suffer from much higher levels of far-right violence. Another element that it's obvious when you actually go a bit more deeper into the data is that election times are the times where we see a dramatic jump in the number of attacks by far-right elements. Usually it happens the year before the election when the political environment starts to become more contentious and starts to escalate, and when the political rhetoric is becoming more toxic, and also during the election year. Consistently, what we can see that in most elections, again, the year before and the election years, there's a spike in the level of violence. Why this happens? There are several reasons for that. First of all, as I mentioned before, the political environment is much more contentious, is much more militant, and some people feel compelled to express their views also through militant activism and violence. But there's another reason. Because of the structure of the political system in the US, many of these far-right elements have no real ability to penetrate the political system. Very few of them, if any, can actually be elected to official positions, to public positions. They cannot really gain any kind of representations in the existing political parties in this country. And election time actually reflects to them how much they lack any real political influence, how much they are actually incapable in basically promoting their policies through legitimate means. And that creates frustration, anger, which leads naturally to more violence. Okay? However, one of the interesting trends that we also see is that actually there was a rise in the level of violence in 2017 after the last elections. If you look at the other post-election years, usually we see some decline in the level of violence. In 2017, there's actually a rise in the level of violence. And when we're trying to explain that, we can come up with several hypotheses. First of all, it is possible that, far-right groups and individuals feel more comfortable to operate when they perceive to get some kind of legitimacy from the political system. And this is something that I'll talk about later on, but a lot of the conspiracy theories and a lot of the rhetoric of the far right that I've read in their website and in their publication in 2011 and 2012, and at that time they were basically exclusive to the far right. You haven't seen these conspiracy theories really being manifested in any other forums. Many of these conspiracy theories, many of these views now actually are part of the mainstream discourse, especially on the right side of the political spectrum. So basically what many of these individuals feel is that they actually today have more legitimacy to express, even violently, their beliefs. Some of them also believe that, because they have what we can, quote unquote, define as some kind of a supportive political environment, also they will not be punished as harshly as they would have in other times. And in some cases also, the violence reflects also their attempt to force or to push or put pressure on their leaders to also promote legislation that is compatible to their views, right? So they want to, through their violence, they want to pressure their policymakers. Okay, we elected you, we're now controlling 2017, the Republican Party controlled both the legislative and the executive, and also in many ways the judicial system. So there was a strong pressure, okay, let's utilize this opportunity. And one of the ways in which they can actually put pressure on their elected officials is through violence. Another interesting, some interesting insights we can actually garner from looking at the geographical dispersion of these attacks. And most people are surprised when they look at the map, and the numbers are basically indicating the number of attacks in each state. First of all, the Deep South, which was, in the mindset of many Americans, is considered the hotbed of white supremacy. It's actually not so violent. Where do we see the violence? We see the violence in those states that are going through a rapid process of diversification. Actually, when we're looking at the data, what we see is that the single most important predictors of rising the violence is actually the growth rate of the Asian American population and the Hispanic population. So if you look at all these states, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, Florida, California, these are the states that are actually going a rapid process of diversity. But you probably will answer me, okay, but these are actually very tolerant states. Well, these are not tolerant blue states. These are tolerant blue cities. So if you're in New York City, yes, it's a very tolerant city. You go upstate New York, it's a bit less tolerant. What happens now, however, is that also upstate New York going a process of diversification. That's also true for central Pennsylvania. That's also true for Western Mass. I just hosted at UMass a group of second-generation immigrants from Nigeria, and they're actually from Springfield. So you see how areas that in the past were very homogeneous are going through a process of diversification, and that creates in some of these communities some backlash and rise in the level of violence. So basically the immigrants are not just concentrated anymore in the main urban areas, but actually because of their upwards mobilization process, the second and the third generation, which is more educated, have higher levels of income, actually move to the suburbs. And when they get to the suburbs and they get to these fairly homogeneous communities, then we see this kind of a backlash in the size of violence. I still remember when I was teaching at West Point, I took my kids once to the central, some kind of a pond at the center of our small town in upstate New York. And I let my kids play in the playground, and I just wanted to sit at the gazebo that was sitting on the yard near the pond. And then when I entered the gazebo, I had racial slurs all over the place. And that was a town that was going through this process of diversification. You actually could feel it when we lived there. So this is what's going on, and this explains why we see more violence in actually blue state, which again, there's no such a thing as a blue state. There's blue cities, and all the rest, even in the blue states, it's pretty much red. I don't have a lot of time, but one of the interesting things that we see, and I'll actually move a bit farther. We should have it here somewhere. One of the things that we actually see, and this is something that it's interesting to identify, is first of all, is that each one of these different types of far-right groups actually have also different methods of operation. So for example, skinheads usually are focusing more on acts of vandalism, but they rarely attack law enforcement. Militias are much more hostile and usually much more of a threat to law enforcement and government targets, for example. When you're talking, for example, about the far right, the most lethal and the most actually radical groups are actually the fundamentalist far-right groups, the Christian identity groups, which they don't perpetrate a lot of attacks, but when they do, they usually generate much more casualties and much more damage. So the fact that we are trying to provide more nuance and to help you to understand this diverse landscape of the far right is not just because we just want you to be familiar with this ideology, because actually that can tell us a lot about how they operate and what kind of threat they represent. So when I go to NYPD and I give usually I give briefing to the intelligence division of NYPD, I always tell them, if someone attacked a police officer, it's probably not the skinheads. They just don't do that. If you see them marching with uniforms, these are neo-Nazis. The neo-Nazis are the ones who usually use uniforms because they want to imitate the practices of the Nazi party in Germany that basically forced their people to wear uniforms all the time and adopted a very military structure. So each one of these groups actually has its own practices and norms and way in which they operate. And what you can see here, for example, is that indeed each one of them is focusing on different type of targets and different type of operations. Another thing that we found out in our studies is that there's a fairly strong correlation between the composition of the legislative on the local level, also on the national level, and the level of violence. That means that there's a direct correlation if, for example, the right is on the rise, politically wise, electorally wise, we see a rise in the level of violence. Interestingly, for the same reason, we actually see more pro-life violence after a pro-life decision of the Supreme Court. And in both cases is because these people, when their political camp is being perceived as winning, they are being empowered, they feel more comfortable, and they feel that there's more legitimacy for them to use violence. So in this case, what we see is that this is not violence that comes from the weak side. These are not, this is not what we usually, we like to say terrorism is the weapon of the weak. In this case, terrorism reflects sense of empowerment. When they're winning on the electoral level, on the political level, they feel empowered and feel more legitimacy to react violently. One thing that I don't have the graph specifically here, but I wanted to mention is the fact that when you're looking at the type of targets in a high resolution, one thing that is very clear is that there's two types of targets that are on the rise. The first are LGBTQ, which are gaining also more and more prominence within the rhetoric of the far right. And secondly, religious sites. It's not just anecdotal, the fact that we see more synagogues and mosques and churches being attacked. This is actually something that we see very clear in the data. And there's a dramatic rise in the last decade or so. There's operational advantage for that. If you are a KKK activist and you want to attack Muslims, you can be pretty sure that if you're attacking a mosque, you'll be able to target Muslims and so on and so forth for other types of religious communities. They don't need to engage in any kind of sophisticated operation to target a specific group. So this is very concerning. There's also a psychological element to that. Religious sites are also the center of the community. It's one of those facilities or institutions that provide symbolically, but also practically provide a very strong sense of safety, of security, of basically some kind of sense of community. By attacking religious sites, you can actually maximize the psychological impact of their attack, because it's way more than just attacking a specific building. It's attacking, in many cases, really the symbolic soul of the communities. And they understand that, and they understand the implication of attacking a religious site. A few things that I want to say about some other interesting things that we see. I'll go back for a sec, yes. Usually when we think about terrorism or these kind of groups, we think about this kind of plots, these kind of attacks that they are planning for weeks or months. Actually, many of these acts of violence are actually what we call spontaneous. That means that they do not think in advance about these attacks, but they're just being triggered. So, for example, when Shin Urbanski met Richard Collins at the campus at the University of Maryland, right? And attacked Richard Collins. Richard Collins was actually a cadet. He was not a cadet anymore when he was attacked. He was actually a second lieutenant already. Shin Urbanski never met Richard Collins before. He didn't know who he is. He knew just one thing. He's a black guy that is in my campus. And altercation occurred, and eventually he stabbed Richard Collins. And there's plenty of cases. Actually, almost half of the incidents that we identify are actually what we can define spontaneous, in the sense that the perpetrator didn't plan that in advance. So what you see, these are people that suddenly, for example, they go to a restaurant, they see a mixed-race couple, and they are being triggered, and then they start to act in a very hostile way. In many cases, they also use violence. So there's a very spontaneous elements to many of these attacks, and that actually makes our work more challenging, because in many ways, when they get into these kind of situations, they are being triggered. I don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to move a bit more quickly, talking a little bit about what communities can do. I'd be happy to talk about the current waves of militias, which is, in my view, the most concerning new threat that we are facing. But first of all, we need to understand there's no silver bullet, really. We need to further develop better mechanism to counter these views in the marketplace of ideas. And the current marketplace is the digital marketplace. So the same way that we see thousands or hundreds of thousands of members in forums that are being run by far-right groups, we need to develop this kind of mechanism that will allow us to disseminate the type of information and the type of knowledge that we want to disseminate. We need to rethink our immigration policies. The Europeans now experiencing, even in a more difficult way, the failures of their immigration policies. We need to rethink about immigration policies and how we can build it in a way that will allow us to engage in a better integration of immigrants without creating the backlash. So, for example, if you're talking about these small towns in blue states, we need to think about how we help these communities to embrace these new immigrants in a positive manner. One thing that we don't do a lot is looking at the past, and one of the things that was extremely effective in the past in countering the activities of many of these far-right groups are civil lawsuits. In the 90s, the FBI sued almost every far-right group that they were able to find, and usually they were able to bankrupt these groups, and then they just disappeared. We don't do that anymore. I'm not sure why, but this is one of the approaches that we can adopt. In terms of communities, I wrote several ideas for what communities can do. But again, I think it's extremely important to find ways to develop emotional attachment of the individuals to their community. One of the things that we see, radicalization, is not a cognitive process in many cases. It's an emotional process. If you can create an emotional attachment between an individual to his community, there's much less chances that he'll become hostile and develop animosity towards his community. And eventually probably will not use violence to promote his views. So that's what I have for you for now. I'll be happy to answer questions about much of the materials in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arie. We could go on, I'm sure, for quite a while. And hopefully some of the other issues that you touched upon might be brought up in the audience participation afterwards. Our next speaker is Melissa Kraus. Melissa is an attorney and the Associate Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League of New England. Her work centers around incident response, programming, and community outreach. She also works on several of the organization's legislative priorities. Before starting at ADL, Melissa was a judicial law clerk in the Massachusetts Appeals Court. She received her BA at George Washington University and her JD from Boston University School of Law. This evening, Melissa will speak about the state of hate in Massachusetts. In this presentation, she'll discuss hate incidents and hate crimes, talk about some specific recent incidents that have occurred throughout New England. Melissa Kraus.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to echo everyone else's sentiments. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm honored to be on this panel and to be having this very important conversation with all of you. So today, I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, you will better understand recent hate crimes and incidents that have happened throughout Massachusetts. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident, because that distinction can be very important, and also gain familiarity with the best practices in response to hate in your community. So for anyone who may not be familiar with ADL, our mission, we were founded in 1913, with the mission of stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. And I mention this because I think that a lot of people think of ADL as a Jewish organization, as an organization that is focused on anti-Semitism, and while that is very much true, we are focused on anti-Semitism, a key part of our mission, and something that has always been part of our mission, is securing justice and fair treatment to all. So even if a lot of the things that I say are applicable to anti-Semitism, I also encourage you to think about it more broadly and think about this in combating all forms of hate. So I'm going to do a little interactive session, quick little true or false quiz about hate crime laws. So true or false, a hate crime cannot be committed by someone who shares the identity of the victim, meaning a black person cannot commit a hate crime against another black person, etc. How many people think that's true? Just a quick show of hands. And false? Okay, that's correct. A hate crime can be committed by someone from the same group. A hate crime really depends on the identity of the victim, not of the perpetrator. True or false, hate crime laws give special treatment to certain classes of victims. How many people think that that's correct? And false? Okay, a little bit split here. People are confused. So I would say that hate crimes do not give special treatment to certain classes of victims, but this is a question that often people think is true. However, the reason that they don't give special treatment is because there's no one group that is benefited by hate crime laws. Hate crime laws will protect anyone who has been the victim based on their race, religion, sexual orientation, and a number of other groups that I will discuss. So it doesn't matter what your race is, it just matters whether or not you have been the victim of that hate crime. So some people may be more likely to be victims of hate crimes, but the law will protect everyone equally. And true or false, hate crime laws criminalize speech or thought. How many people think that that's true? And false? Right again. So hate crime laws don't criminalize speech or thought. It matters what the intent behind the crime is, and sometimes your speech can indicate that, but it won't actually penalize you for the speech. So to define hate crime, number one, there needs to be a criminal act. There has to actually be a crime. Number two, it has to be against a person or property. The victim must be intentionally selected, and it has to be because of the victim's actual or perceived race, religion, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. And I will note that this is actual or perceived, so it doesn't really matter what the victim's identity is, it only matters what the perpetrator thinks that their identity is. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some incidents that have come through my office and talk a little bit about whether these are hate crimes, hate incidents, and then I'll go into a little bit about how an organization like ADL would respond. So here we have some flyers that were posted by a group called Patriot Front, very anti-immigrant rhetoric, keep America American, and a lot of the same themes that were touched on earlier today about keeping immigrants out. And then we also have a swastika that was stamped out in the snow. So I'm going to do one more show of hands for anyone who thinks that these things would be hate crimes, or people who think that they are not hate crimes. Okay, yes, that's right. So they wouldn't be hate crimes because in these instances we have that first element missing. There's no actual crime here. In the case of the flyering, it depends on where it's posted, but it's usually covered by free speech. And as for the swastika, there's no destruction of property because it's just stamped in the snow. These were two recent incidents that we saw. On the left, we have Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, who spoke at UMass recently, I believe in May, at a BDS event, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, a pro-Palestine event. And then on the right, these two gentlemen holding the straight pride flag that you may have heard about, the straight pride parade in Boston that was at the end of this summer. And again, both of these things would be covered by free speech, so it's not actually a hate crime, but a lot of times these extremist messages will be interpreted as such, and they come through our office a lot. And ADL often will work with, will make a statement about it, or will work with organizations like UMass, but it's not technically a hate crime. And then this last one is, you may recognize the Holocaust Memorial that is in downtown Boston. And if you haven't seen it before, it's 6 towers that all have glass panels, and you can see that the glass panels here were destroyed. And when we first saw this office, when our office first saw this incident, it was very quickly perceived to be a hate crime. But upon further investigation, we actually found out that the person who did it, it was around 2 a.m. one night. He was coming home from a bar that was in the area. It wasn't clear that he knew what the memorial was. So things can get a little tricky. And I mention this incident because a lot of times these incidents require further investigation to see what they are. However, I will also stress that even if you think something is an incident, it is very important to report it either to ADL or to your local law enforcement, preferably both, because then they can be investigated and we can see what actually happened. So I don't bring these up to say that hate incidents are less bad than hate crimes, but to show that there is a key difference between them, but that you should still report it because we have to get the facts in these sorts of situations. So then this brings me to bias-motivated incidents. For things that are not hate crimes, they could then qualify as a bias-motivated incident. And there are 2 types. The first type is something that is non-criminal activity, but is motivated by hatred. And that's something like hate speech, hate rallies, hate flyers that are distributed, a lot of the examples that I just touched on. So that first element of the actual crime is missing. And then for the second incident, that is criminal conduct, which is motivated by bias, but it doesn't meet one of the other elements of the statute. So a lot of times that will mean there's no specific victim who is targeted, or again, there's no specific target, like hate graffiti on public property, and no intentional victim. So this then brings me to some of the incidents that ADL has covered. Some of you might be familiar with the incident in Fall River that happened a few months ago in the spring. 59 graves were tagged with graffiti or overturned, and it was just a destruction of a Jewish cemetery that on a scale that we really haven't seen very often, with things saying expel the Jews, Hitler was right, really disturbing things. And the way that ADL responded to this, that's our regional director, Robert Treston, who went out to Fall River the next day to speak. And I bring up this incident because you might see the bottom right picture. The community response was really overwhelming in response to this incident. And that is not just the Jewish community. That was all of Fall River that came and supported the Jews of the community, came to the cemetery. So even when it's an anti-Semitic incident, it's so important to have that entire community support, and it's really rewarding to see that. And that's something that I think ADL is particularly happy about in response to incidents like this. Another incident that happened in this spring were the Chabad fires, if any of you have heard about that. Those were 3 arson attempts at Chabad houses. That's one of the rabbis and his wife there. And the perpetrator was never caught, so The FBI and ADL have both put out a reward trying to catch the perpetrators, but still no word yet, unfortunately. And then this one is another incident that happened at a Boy Scout camp. There was one black counselor, and he received the Evil Monkey Merit Badge, and all of these badges were kind of given as a joke. You might see another one was the Nantucket Nazi Award that was given to who was seen as the camp disciplinarian. And this is an incident that a lot of people, I think, might just think, oh, well, this was at a camp. It's not really, I don't want to say it's not a big deal, because to us it really is. But I think for a lot of people, especially in compared to that Fall River scenario, they might think, oh, well, why is ADL getting involved with this? ADL got very involved, and our regional director had a lot of conversations with this counselor, because when things happen, even just to one individual, that's creating a climate that is showing that this kind of behavior is acceptable. And that's what we really need to discourage, is when these incidents happen to one person, no matter what background they are of, if they're not Jewish, if it's a race-based incident, no matter what it is, we have to step in and fight it, because these are the sorts of things that are then going to escalate and are showing these sorts of incidents are allowed in our community. And that's the message that we really can't let get across. So now, how do we respond to incidents? The hope is always that these things are not going to happen in our community. But if they do, we need to know how to react. So I also, if you haven't picked up a toolkit on your way in, I encourage you to pick one up on your way out. They were the toolkits that were given at our recent forum on anti-Semitism, and they have a little more detail than I have in my slides here. So I'd encourage you to pick those up. Number one is to lobby for legislation that's important to you. Representative McGovern brought up a few that I think are very important. We also have some state-based legislation that's in our legislative priorities. So I would encourage you, if you find something that you think is meaningful, then email, call your legislators, and speak up for it. And also interrupt hate when you hear it. Obviously, that's with the caveat of if you feel safe doing so. But if you see something happening, if you see someone that you know saying something hateful or bigoted, then interrupt it. Say, why did you say that? What makes you think that that's right? Challenge it in the moment. Share facts is the second one, and that's to share information or data if you know what it is, and the best way to fight a lot of stereotypes is to challenge it with the actual information. And talk about issues that are important to you with the people around you, and that's particularly for young people. The children, grandchildren, people who are going to be inheriting a lot of the world's problems, they need to know how to fight it, and they need to know what issues are important to stand up for. So I would encourage you, even if these conversations are difficult, talking about anti-Semitism, talking about racism and bigotry, it's still very important to have those conversations with them so that they can also challenge it with their peers. And show strength. Report incidents to ADL and or to law enforcement, and I can also go into more detail about how you would actually do that. Help others by volunteering your knowledge, do some community building activities, and stand up for other marginalized groups. And if you don't take anything away from my presentation, I hope I gave you a few things, but the number one thing that I hope that you walk away with is how important it is to stand up for other groups. We cannot fight hate against only one group. We have to fight it for everybody. And you have to show that all forms of hate against anyone are unacceptable. So I did mention a few times reporting to ADL, so just quickly, the way that you would do that is first, if you feel unsafe, then call 911. But to report an incident, visit adl.org/report or /report incident, either one works. Complete the form. It's going to ask you where it happened, if you have any sorts of links or videos or photos, and some information about yourself. And then an ADL staff member, probably me, will get back to you shortly after. And then also, if something happens online, I know that a lot of times people will see things on Facebook. I would stress that you report it to the platform first, and then you can report it to ADL, because we're pretty limited in what we can do unless it's already been reported to the platform. So ADL is continuing to fight hate in the community. We have a few things here on what we do, but I'm hoping that today you got some takeaway about how you can continue that work and continue that fight. So we'll do some questions after, but thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And thank you to all of our panelists. That was very enlightening. Sobering, but enlightening. So we want to open this up to our audience. You may have questions for any of the panelists, or you may just have a comment about the topic of the evening. I'm thinking of this as a conversation. We're going to have a couple of folks within the room with handheld mics. What I'm going to ask people to do is to raise your hand to be acknowledged, wait for the mic to get to you, and then say your comment or ask your question. Please, we got a lot of folks here. I suspect we're going to get a lot of input. So keep your comments brief so we can get to as many people as possible. This is a forum for questions, comments. It is not a forum for speech making. Please. So, and I do apologize in advance if we can't get to everybody before time runs out. We are meeting in the social hall afterwards for some light refreshments, at which times our speakers hopefully will be available and we can talk to them on a casual basis that way. So with that in mind, let's see who would like to be recognized. Ted, we have...
I can speak loud enough.
We're live streaming, so you need to be on the mic for the live stream. Sure.
Question for Dr. Perliger first, and then to the panel. One of the important points that you made at the very end was that an important approach is to nip the marginal individuals in the bud, if possible. Is there data on when the individuals become, I'm reluctant to use the word marginalized because I don't think it's a marginal movement anymore, but is there data on when these individuals cross their thresholds? Is it in high school? Do they inherit it from their parents? Are there important patterns that we can identify?
Yeah, so definitely youth are vulnerable to this kind of propaganda or this kind of manipulation of information. And I think that what happens to them is that, first of all, they feel marginalized. They feel that they don't feel this sense of they don't have any real emotional attachment or any feel of being part of the community, of their community. And the community may be their own specific local community, it may be the country where they live. But again, when we're looking at these individuals, what we feel is that they have some kind of they're missing something in terms of their emotional attachment. When you don't feel that you belong to anything, you're looking for something to be attached to. You're looking for a cause. You're looking for something that will provide you some kind of a resonance for your being. And then they're looking for other options. And some of them, when they're looking for other options, they find these radical groups that are very effective in providing them this kind of an ideological framework that makes them basically part of their own online virtual community. When you are trying to understand why more than 350 Americans traveled from the US to the Middle East to join ISIS, right? They didn't join ISIS because they have some strong familiarity with the jihadi ideology or because they're really familiar with the intricacies of the political conflicts in the Middle East. No, they have no clue. Many of them are not really familiar with the situation in the Middle East. Many of them know very little about ISIS ideology. They do that because ISIS was able to convince them that they're not really Americans, but they are part of some kind of a transnational community of jihadists, and that it's their obligation to join their brothers who are fighting in the Middle East. It's all about this kind of emotional attachment that they were able to create with these young recruits. However, they would have never been able to do that if these recruits were already have some kind of a stable, positive attachment to some elements within their own communities or within their own societies. And this is where we are actually losing them. And that's true also when you're looking at radicalization within the far right. And it's not a specific point in time. You can be radicalized when you're in your 20s, or you can be radicalized when you're in your teens. And actually for many young adults, you know, this process of becoming adults is a fairly long process these days, you know. So the period of vulnerability is actually extending. So, you know, so I think that's what we need to do. And one of the ways to do that is find a communal mechanism that can help people feel part of, and that they can feel that they have some kind of a cause that can actually help them to frame their identity as part of the community. When you cannot really identify effectively your communal identity and not just your individual identity, then you are becoming vulnerable to militant propaganda and these kind of messaging campaigns that these organizations are engaged in.
I would just very briefly echo what Dr. Perliger had said. In sort of a very pithy sense, many of the folks that join these groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's Daesh or ISIS or various far-right groups, and I've studied a lot of this stuff over the years. I've even known people personally who have entered into some of these groups in the past. And one of the things that makes clear is that oftentimes, particularly in our public discourse, we tend to fixate on things like the content online. You take a look at that picture of like the Chad versus the Virgin sort of a thing, and I look at that, in my 18-year-old self for a moment, and I think to myself like, wow, what a crappy picture. Kids aren't necessarily attracted to those kinds of things and whatnot. It's more that if the content plays any sort of a role, it's that it gets people curious, but they stay for the sense of community. That's what they're looking for. They may come out of curiosity from the content, but they stay for the sense of community. One thing I think that's also important here is there's a lot of this talk about online radicalization and online entry into extremism and hate, and that's extremely important. What I think is also important for the audiences, and I don't think that either of the panelists would disagree on this either, is it's not just important to reach out online, but it's also about the person behind the digital device and what can be done offline as well. And there's some interesting things that have been done, but having these sorts of discussions here, not to be too generic about it, but are an important first start towards that, because at the end of the day, we are dealing with human beings, especially for young people. And so, one thing that I would always remember is that you never know who you might even be talking to, and sometimes even just a human and compassionate interaction may end up influencing people's behavior. And I will say personally that not only have I, during the course of my research, have I heard stories of but even when I've known other people in the past who have considered trying to move down that pathway, that just having those face-to-face interactions and talking through with them, while not condoning some of the hateful ideas that they may have been espousing, but also trying to talk to them rather than talking down to them, and communicating, I think, can achieve some surprising results.
Okay, let's get somebody from this side of the room. Oh, and please stand when you ask a question. Yes, thanks.
This is directed to Dr. Perliger. When you talked about taking your children to that upstate New York community, I pretty much know where you went. And basically, a similar incident occurred within about a half an hour there, where basically a person basically desecrated a Jewish cemetery. They identified the child as basically the valedictorian of the high school class. And basically the punishment was for him to do some community service. It seems to me that basically the educational system in those upstate New York communities needs some revision, and a lot of these local communities need some education about basically hate crimes. Thank you.
You're probably right. We cannot just count on localities that are very short in resources, are very short in knowledge, are very short in capabilities. They have many other needs that they need to address. So we need to identify various mechanisms to help them develop these kind of educational programs, social programs, humanitarian programs, and to find ways to help these communities to deal with the crisis that they're going through. And they are going through a crisis because the nature of the community changes, the demographic composition changes, and people who lived in these communities for 20 or 30 years, they have mixed feelings about these changes. As we would expect. And we need to help them to process these changes in a way that will not demean them or will not portray them as necessarily as some kind of people who represent some evil. No, these are people who are facing some significant changes in their community and they need help to process them, and we need to identify ways to do that. Currently, we do nothing. We just do nothing. There's no really nationwide or statewide programs that are focusing on where the violence is actually happening. And the reason is because a lot of the discourse about the far right is being done without actually utilizing an actual data. And this is one of the things that we need to acknowledge, that a lot of our public discourse, not just in this specific issue, but in general, is being handled without actually exploiting a lot of data that we actually have on these phenomena. So the data allows us to engage in a more high-resolution policies that can actually attack the threat where it's prominent. We learned that this is probably way more effective than this kind of very generic statewide or nationwide programs. That will be much less effective. And now we have the data to do that, something that we didn't have in the past. And I just want to say one more thing about the cyber domain. Yes, because of the cyber domain, many of these groups have better capability in disseminating their ideology, in communicating with followers, and with providing their followers, operational guidelines, et cetera, but it also makes them much more visible. It makes it easier for us to monitor their activities. It's actually helping us to get more familiar with their rhetoric. So, if in the past, if you really wanted to know what's going on, you actually had to go to a white power music festival, or you had to go to one of their conferences and actually buying their bulletins. Today, you can actually do it from your chair in your office, and you can actually follow up and really track changes in their rhetoric and so on. So yes, there's some advantages that they get from the evolution of the cyber domain, but also it helps us doing our work. And when I'm talking us, I'm talking about academics, but also law enforcement.
Hello, thank you for being here. I have two questions. Number one, My first question is for Dr. Perliger and Mr. Beutel. I wanted to know the average age group of the members of the organizations that you've been studying. And my second question is to Ms. Kraus. And I wanted to know whether you have, is there any movement in your organization or organizations such as yours to sort of educate the educators of our schools into not just creating classes about the subject, but in everyday situation, when those situation rises on everyday classroom, how to deal with it and how to sort of reform that situation and positively impact the both groups that are involved.
So in terms of the age group, so the individuals who actually exercise violence usually are young adults or, or teenagers, and these are the ones who usually are mainly involved in the violence. However, if you're talking about the composition of these groups, it goes way up. We're talking about the 40s and even the 50s. And if you remember, there was an attack a few years ago in a Jewish community center in Kansas, in a suburb, in an upscale suburb of Kansas City, which was basically where 3 people were killed. It was perpetrated by a 78-year-old neo-Nazi. So it's a fairly diverse. What it's important to emphasize is that many of the members of these groups are actually people in their 40s and their 50s, people who have a professional career. They are established people. This concept of terrorists are poor people who don't have any future ahead of them, that's a misconception. That's not true, not just on the far right, but in many other domains of terrorism. So that's most of what we see. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question. I mean, Dr. Perliger, I think, is the one with the access to the data. In terms of during my time at SPLC and continuing to sort of monitor the various facets of the far right, one of the things that, broadly speaking, in terms of the strategic landscape, that I do notice, though, is that at least there are certain segments that are undergoing somewhat of a generational shift. Particularly if you look at certain segments of the white supremacy, white nationalist movement, the so-called online alt-right that many people may have heard about. That context, that milieu tends to be a bit younger. You still have older guard individuals in their 40s and 50s and 60s that are out there in various facets of the white supremacist movement. But one of the striking features, particularly about the alt-right, if we're talking about the racist and misogynist segments of the alt-right, is that generally speaking, it is their content and a lot of the people that have been identified as synonymous with that movement in that context tend to be younger individuals. It's not uniform by any means. And you do have all kinds of different dynamics beyond age as well. You have class dynamics. You do have education differences as well. You have some people who are highly educated individuals, others who are less so. In the case of other segments of the far right, like the anti-government, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, those groups, they tend to be a bit older, though, still. But again, in terms of age range and education, you have a wide range of demographics. And so for again, to go to Dr. Perliger's point about, this stereotyped profile of someone who might just simply be, older and uneducated, that is not uniformly true by any means. And in some of the other segments of the far right, outside of white supremacy, they're not exclusively the domain of white men either, perhaps alarmingly so. Certainly, I know that even within white supremacy, there's a large contingent of women that are extremely, extremely active. Here in Massachusetts, one of the slides that images before regarding Soros, George Soros and International Holocaust Memorial Day, that was by a woman who actually leads a national woman-focused anti-government militia group that has chapters in several states across the country. So, you know, often people will think that there's a specific demographic profile that's there, but depends on which part of the far right that you're talking about. It's not necessarily a uniform thing.
Basically, I have one quick comment.
Melissa has done,
Sorry.
respond to
Sorry.
one.
I'll make it quick. Just in regards to the educational programming, ADL New England, which is my region, we are in, I believe the number is 120 schools throughout the region, and we do, I'm not on the education team, but we do a lot of work in that space, and in the schools. We have a very robust peer training program that deals with the kids, and that's obviously a peer training program, but it also involves some of the teachers as well. So we are very active in schools because we see a lot of incidents happen in schools. And we have a lot of great community partners like Facing History and ourselves that do a lot in schools as well. So I would say that, you know, kind of going back to your situation as well, your experience, a lot of times when these incidents happen from kids, it's a reflection of what they see going on at home, online. So it is very important to be active in the schools as well to combat that at a young age. So I'm very glad to be working for ADL, which is doing a lot in schools.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I have basically one quick comment. I taught high school for many years. Didn't hide that I was Jewish, didn't say I was Jewish, it was just part of me. And many times I would hear students utter anti-Semitic comments, and the best way to deal with that is to turn around and tell the kid, I'm Jewish, what's wrong with this? And the kid would instantly become incredibly embarrassed, especially kids who really liked me. And we'd have a discussion. So I think one of the best ways, at least with teenagers, to deal with this is to personalize it. I am Jewish. You like me. You approve of me. What are your reasons for saying what you just said? And that seemed to work very well in my 34 years of teaching high school.
Did they ever respond to your question?
Yes.
What did they say?
Yeah. Well, first they would stutter and become upset and become embarrassed. Typical teenagers. Okay, including former students. Sorry. One of mine. But then they would have learned a lot from their parents. My mother said this, my father said this, my aunt said this. And I would say, okay, what do you think a Jew is? First of all, not a race, not an ethnic group, it's a religion. But the main thing that I think I taught these kids, casually, kids who really approved of me and liked me, was that when you say something like this, you're talking about me. How does that make you feel? And 99% of the time, the kids would back down, stutter, become embarrassed, and I'd say, if your parents want to talk to me, feel free to give them my name and have them talk to me.
Great, thank you.
I just want to give a quick comment. I think one thing that you need to remember that you are a source of authority. You are a source of authority. You represent authority in the school. My guess is that they're much less reluctant, and they'll probably respond differently if it was another kid. I know, for example, just in the last year or so, I encountered two cases, one in which one kid told to another student that she'll burn in hell just because she's a Jew, and so on and so forth, and that demanded a significant intervention because no one else intervened, including the teacher in the classroom. Another case is actually not far from here. There's Farmington, maybe? I'm new to Mass, so I'm sorry about that. Yes. So there was like 20 or 30 kids. They downloaded an app called Kick the Jew. Basically, significant pressure had to be put on the principal until he actually was willing to engage in actually doing something about that. So I just feel that in the current environment, when their level of exposure to these kind of ideas is much more significant, when there's much less a monopoly on who is the source of authority and what is what is a valid and legitimate information or knowledge, I think things are a bit more complex. I'm sure that, in many cases that was helpful, but, I feel that the environment right now is a bit more complex and demand sometimes a much more militant and rigorous response.
Thank you. Ted, one more down there? Okay, we're going to get one more question, and then Rabbi Gurvitz wants to say a few words.
I think the issue of education, of course, is very important, but I think one of the problems is that so many fundamentalist groups in this country homeschool their kids or have them in private religious academies that teach the intolerance, that are anti-gay or white supremacists and that type of thing. So I don't know what can be done about that, and I wondered if anybody had any thoughts or suggestions.
I'll just say something. Before I did my PhD on really positive and optimistic issues such as terrorism and violence and so on, I actually did in my master's degree, what I studied is the effectiveness of civic education. What I was trying to see if indeed civic education classes has any impact on the tendency of students to adopt democratic, liberal, humanistic views. What I found actually, was the fact that the content of the textbooks, the content of the material had no significance at all, very limited significance. What really was impactful was what educators call class climate. If the teacher, for example, allowed different opinions to be expressed in the classroom, even if the majority of the class object these views, if the students feel comfortable in expressing different views, not necessarily consensual views, and overall, if the teachers and the students develop this kind of environment where there's a respect to different views, these kind of students that actually study in this kind of environment actually showed a much more democratic, higher levels of democratic attitudes and humanistic attitudes, which means that it's really much more important are the behavioral cues. So it's not always what the parent says to his kid, it's how he behaves when he's these kind of environments, right? So if a parent walks with his kid and they see a racial slur on the wall, but he doesn't express and doesn't provide the right emotional and behavioral cues to the kids, that eventually provides a signal to the kid, what is the importance of this, how I should react to this, and so on and so forth. And it's behavioral elements and also about providing context. I grew up in Israel, so in Israel I actually had to attend Bible studies classes, right? And if you read the Bible, there's a lot of sections which are, some people may argue, may contradict some, modern, humanistic, liberal practices, right? But it's about the context, understanding the context of these verses, understanding the time in which they were basically authored, understanding the environment in which they authored. It's about context. And this is something that we need to clarify to our kids. The context is important, right? And I don't think we do that enough, to be honest.
Ted tells me there's one more burning, quick question.
Thank you. A trend that I've heard about recently that I find quite alarming, and I didn't hear any of you comment on it, so this is really directed to any of you, is the infiltration of white nationalists into law enforcement organizations. And that has particularly alarming consequences, especially thinking about the specter of Kristallnacht and how the people were watching, the police were just watching all the destruction happening. And so just wondering about to what extent that you know of that and what you think about that and what you think can be done about it.
That's not a new thing. Anyone knows where Fort Leavenworth is? So in the 80s and the early 90s, there was, if you got into the entrance of Fort Leavenworth, which is a military base, you actually had a big sign recruitment sign for the National Alliance, that at that time was the biggest neo-Nazi movement in the US. These groups were very, very focusing on mobilizing support from law enforcement, from veterans, and from active duty officers. This is a constant feature. Actually, when I briefed once the Chief of Staff of the Army, he actually commissioned us to conduct a research about how these groups try to mobilize recruits and support from the Army, and we did the study. We provide some recommendations. I'll just say that what really concerns me is the emergence of new militias. I'm not sure how many of you heard about the Oath Keepers.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So the Oath Keepers are basically, it's a militia movement that has chapters all over the country, very active, in some cases violent, and it's based completely on former law enforcement or active duty officer. And they also have members who are active duty these days. They are members of law enforcement and the military. And the biggest concern for me, at least, is that because of what they do, because of what they represent, they have substantial legitimacy from the public, right? We tend to trust our law enforcement. We tend to be thankful for veterans and military people. And so they have this kind of unique legitimacy within the American, among the American public. The concern is that they'll use this legitimacy and this kind of positive sentiments towards them in order to legitimize their organizations, to legitimize their acts, and to legitimize many of their views, which are very radical. So that's something that we should look into it. And I can tell you, I served. I was a DoD employee for 6 years. I had the opportunity to travel all over the country and abroad and to meet with military people. And this is definitely should be a concern. So I think you hit on an important point.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add, while I was at SPLC, one of my areas of focus was the anti-government. I am actually very glad to hear Dr. Perliger say, yes, white supremacists in law enforcement, but especially the anti-government movement. And I think that, to me, is, aside from the fact, so I worked on the anti-government desk, but one of the things that has always concerned me about the anti-government movement itself is the fact that it shares a lot of similarities with a lot of rhetoric that we would commonly think of as associated with white supremacy, and yet in some ways it can be more pernicious because it sheds a lot of the overt racist baggage, but still retains a lot of the same storylines, conspiracy thinking, just changing some of the cast of characters. And that arguably, I would say, can even make it more dangerous and easier to move into the mainstream. Whereas if you have someone who's literally just out and about with a swastika on their chest, you can spot and recognize that. But it's harder, though, when the person instead is citing the Constitution and the U.S. flag and patriotism. That's a lot harder to spot, to detect, and even to argue against sometimes. And so this is why, yes, the Oath Keepers, I think, is a very, very good example. It's not to necessarily downplay, for instance, white supremacists that are also trying to continue to recruit and infiltrate into the ranks of first responders, law enforcement, and military. But there's also this other movement that in some ways is sort of like the offspring, a semi-evolved offspring or mutation of white supremacy that in many ways can even be more pernicious and a little bit harder to deal with. And so we need to be, I think, obviously aware of that. I know, Melissa, you wanted to address something as well?
Thank you. Just to add on to this, mostly in response to the last question, I think that a lot of what we're hearing here tonight is that we really can't reach everybody. There are always going to be people that aren't going to be on our side. But I think that the key there is to change as much of the climate as we can and to reach as many people as we can. Because even if it's not possible to change the mind of a white supremacist, for example, there are things that we can do to make them less comfortable in acting out against the rest of the world and these communities. So I think particularly, for example, with the kids who are homeschooled and hearing these extremist messages, if we are changing the rest of the climate and the minds of their peers and exposing them to these ideas, then that can go a long way.
I want to thank our speakers. For giving us an excellent program tonight. I want to thank all of you for coming, for your curiosity, for your engagement. And I want to remind everybody that we do have some refreshments and we can continue this conversation in the social hall. Please pick up the booklets that Melissa referred to and also the handout that we've created in terms of what are some action items, things you can do. And now to send us off, I want to have Rabbi Gurevitz speak to us.
So our Social Action Committee invited me to close this evening with some brief reflections on the topic of hope, because we've had certainly some sobering information and it's been a serious topic that we've engaged in tonight. And it's easy to walk away with feelings of anxiety and concern. But tonight was not only about what has been happening, what is happening, but also we heard some of the ways in which we can respond. So they asked me to reflect on this. It was a theme of the High Holy Days. Don't panic, I'm not going to give a High Holy Day length sermon at this moment in time. But when we talk about hope, it's more than just a wish. Hope is something that we can grasp with our hands. It's something that we can cling to. It's within our reach. I want to quote Václav Havel, who was a playwright born in Prague, was a leading figure of the Civic Forum, and advocated for democratic reforms, and eventually became president of the Czech Republic. Previously, before that time, under a different regime, he had been imprisoned. And he wrote this: "The kind of hope I often think about, especially in situations that are particularly hopeless, such as prison, I understand above all as a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It's a dimension of the soul. It's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed." We've heard tonight about things that we can do. We can't just put our hope in others to make things happen while we do nothing ourselves to move forward. Congressman McGovern started off this evening saying that nothing changes unless we are the change. And so we cannot be dormant, silent bystanders. Each and every one of us can do something to move us all incrementally toward a better future. Rebecca Solnit, the author of Hope in the Dark, puts it like this: "Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action, and action is impossible without hope." There are many ways we can activate hope right here in our own towns. A number of town-based organizations have been formed right here in our local area in the past few years to bring people together, to learn about each other, and work together to create a kinder, more inclusive and integrated community, the kind of learning and connecting that we heard our panel speak about. Westboro Connects, Southborough's Neighbors for Peace, Ashland United, and several local Hate Has No Home groups. We here at Congregation B'nai Shalom are among the founders of the Central Massachusetts Connections in Faith organization, which covers the entire region, with several events a year whose goal is to bring people of diverse cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds together to learn about each other. Last weekend, there was a remarkable turnout for our full program hosted by the Worcester Islamic Center, and we hope that you will all join us on the morning of January 20th for our second Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Celebration, hosted at the Westboro High School, where our keynote speaker, Maria Milagros, will address this year's theme, Diversity is Our Strength. To every action that is spurred by hate, we can come together to create a stronger, more determined reaction that is spurred by love. And I invite you all to be a part of that solution. So one more thing as we depart from here, and I do hope you'll stay, because a very important part of what we do here and what this is about connecting, to take the time to go down to the social hall and meet some of the people who have been sitting in your row and behind you, because this has been a panel kind of interface, and now is the opportunity for you to find out with whom you've had the pleasure of being in this room this evening. When you head down there, there's one other mitzvah opportunity if you should choose to engage with it. One of our other social action teams here in the congregation in the lead up to Thanksgiving for the last few years has been part of Pie in the Sky, which is a project to support community servings. Community servings provides medically appropriate meal delivery services to the chronically ill. We have a team, and our team sells pies that you can come back and pick up here on the Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning before Thanksgiving. But even if you don't need a pie, there's an opportunity to make a donation of a week's worth of meals to community servings. And one of our temple members has kindly offered that for tonight only, up to the first $180 worth for every pie that we sell towards helping community servings. We'll also make an additional $5 donation to our Social Action Committee's fund that has enabled us to provide this program and to help us provide more programs like this in the future. So you'll find that table in the social hall, and I will wish you in advance a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you very much, everyone.